Hello, everyone who's joined us now. We're going to start in a few minutes. And before we do that, could I ask you to type in the chat box where you are from? So yesterday we had a webinar with participants from all over Ukraine, as well as from some other countries. So I'm interested in knowing what's the geography of today's webinar. Estonia, Odessa, lovely. Okay, Ivano-Frankivsk. Very nice. As far as I can see, the geography of today's webinar is actually a very good one, very wide one, because we have people from all the different parts of Ukraine and from some other countries like Estonia. Lovely, lovely. Okay, looks like it's time to start the webinar. Hello, everyone. My name is Andrei Pigarev, and today I'll be presenting a webinar which is devoted to IELTS visuals. So if you are a teacher who's preparing their students for IELTS, if you're a student who is going to have some preparation devoted to IELTS, or if you are a test taker, so someone who is going to sit the test, I think that the ideas that we're going to be talking about today will be useful or might be useful for you in your preparation and your teaching. So basically, it's called hacking IELTS visuals. And by hacking, I mean that we're going to uncover some basic but very important essentials, which will help better understand what IELTS visuals are and how to work with them. And the examples taken from for today's webinar are from our IELTS Grade online platform, which actually offers an extended preparation for IELTS academic. All right, so let's get started. And first, what we're going to be dealing with today. So basically, we'll refresh. I'm sure that you actually know lots of different things about IELTS visuals, but we'll talk about different kinds of visuals that we might have in the exam itself. We'll focus on understanding what graphs, charts, and diagrams are about, and basically practice reading them, because to an untrained eye, it's in many ways difficult to understand the figures or the objects that are in visuals and make sense of them. So one of the main purposes of our today's webinar is actually learning how to uncover and understand them. We'll focus on the way how to logically organize responses, and we'll touch upon in some way assessment criteria, and actually what is there in assessment criteria that forces us in a way to organize responses in some way. And of course, we'll look at a few different tasks from IELTS visuals and practice planning them. So hopefully by the end of the webinar, you'll be equipped with all the necessary basics and understanding of details, which will be important when dealing with IELTS visuals in the exam or while preparing for it. And let's start with some basics. Something that I think everyone should know, but inside these basics, there are some very important things. So I'd like you to type in your chat box whether the statements A, B, C, D, E, F are true or false. And you can write in the following way. For example, A, T, which stands for option A, true. And I'll give you 1 or 2 minutes for this. And it's a good idea to write all of them at once. I mean, take some time and then type them. So for example, if we look at option A, In academic writing task 1, we deal with different kinds of visuals rather than types of letters. So letter A is false. All right, we have first answers now. Great. Okay, let's have around 30 more seconds. And once you've decided which are true, which are false, think about why, and maybe you can think about better options for false statements. Because looks like we have quite a few of them here. All right, now let's have a look at the answers. So I think actually all of you, most of you are actually true about most of the points, which means that you already know lots of things about the IELTS exam and IELTS visuals in particular. Let me comment on a few things. So when we talk about the style of writing, of course, because we call this section academic writing, and in particular writing task 1, we are supposed to use the so-called academic style, right? So we're going to be focusing on it in a bit more detail a bit later, but this style is important because it's different from the style of writing that we use, for example, in our communication with friends, when emailing, for example, people we know really well, right? Then when we talk about C, a very important point, 150 words, there is basically a minimum number of words that we need to pay attention to and make sure that we have them. Otherwise, we might be penalized based on the number of words that we have. D is a very interesting option, which means that it's not a must. We're given 2 tasks and we are to decide which of these tasks we need to start with. But we'll talk about this as a strategy based on the next slide. When we talk about E, 20 minutes is basically a recommended time that we can use. We can use more of that, less of that. We're not restricted, but overall for both tasks, we have 60 minutes. But we'll talk about why they recommend 20 minutes in a while. And the final thing, I think this is the most important thing in terms of all the points here. When we talk about writing task 1 academic or describing visuals, we are asked not to express our own opinions. We're not asked to talk about the reasons why something happened. And we're not asked to reflect on possible changes or what might happen in the future. So if we include this kind of information, it means that this information is irrelevant and it will affect basically one of the criteria that we have about task completion. So these are some important things to pay attention to. And based on that, let's have a look at some rules of thumb that are important to know about and to follow when we talk about writing task 1. So in the first place, this is about the academic style we've mentioned a while ago. So when we talk about the academic style, there are some traditions or conventions which are about using full forms rather than contractions. For example, in an academic style, it's not a good idea to use something like isn't, aren't, don't, and more basically full forms will be more appropriate. When we talk about incomplete sentences or fragments, this is something that we use in informal speech, in oral communication, rather than in written communication. And if, for example, you write something like, I like IELTS because it's really interesting, and you start your sentence with because it's really interesting, this makes the sentence incomplete and should be avoided when we talk about academic style. And of course, when we have to choose between the language, for example, let's say buddy or lad versus, for example, a friend, of course, we'll opt for the second option because friend is actually a neutral word, whereas lad and buddy are informal examples of informal language. So it's important to focus on these things. And when we talk about our platform that from which we use the examples today, basically we have a section there focusing on academic style, what this is, what should be used and what shouldn't. The next point will be about the number of words. If we talk about the task itself, we are asked to write at least 150 words, which means that this is a requirement. If this requirement isn't met and we have 135 words, for example, 110 words, this will affect the score and you might have minus half a band because the number of words isn't sufficient. So it's important to take this into consideration when writing, especially when checking writing for task 1. Then the next point will be about basically the choice or the strategy, whether to start with task 1 or task 2. A typical way to do it is to start, of course, with task 1 because it's less creative, but it requires more analytical skills to understand the task, to plan it, and then to write. And as a result, it might take more than 20 minutes, some like 25 or 30 minutes. In some situations, candidates do not have enough time to finish their writing task 2, and as a result, their score is lower because writing task 2 is a bit more important than writing task 1 when we compare the weighting or the scoring. So it's a good idea to ask students when they do a full writing test to start with task 1 and see how they can cope with time and word count and basically finishing the task. And in other way, start with writing task 2 and whether they actually can cope with the timing and the word count. So I think this is not a universal strategy, but this is a good strategy actually to keep in mind, try and see how it works in particular situations for specific students. The next thing is about time in general, because 60 minutes generally isn't enough to write 400 words. I mean, 150 words for task 1 and 250 words for task 2. So that's why it is important to make sure that we watch the time, even use a timer when practicing before the exam, to make sure that we can cope with task 1 within, for example, 20-25 minutes, and the essay or task 2 within the time that is left. And the final thing for me will be actually devoted to the last point from the previous slide where we talked about doing what the task asks us to do. So when we talk about describing visuals, we are to describe only the information that is explicitly or obviously presented in these charts, tables, and diagrams, which means basically that there is no information about why it happened or how it might happen. Sometimes there are tasks where we have this information, but if it's not displayed in the task, it's not a good idea to use it in the description. So as you see, we have some very basic things, very basic options of what to do in the exam or approach the tasks. But at the same time, there are many mistakes that are made by candidates based on these very basic points or rules of thumb. And a few more important considerations when we talk about writing task 1. So a little bit earlier, we were talking about the weighting, or basically how important is writing task 1 in comparison with writing task 2. So when, for example, both tasks are 100%, so for writing task 1, a candidate gets 33.3%, which means only 1/3 of the writing score. And this might affect the strategies that we have for it in terms of timing, right? And especially we can see that the number of words is lower, for example, 150 words in comparison with 250. So a very specific example to illustrate how it works. Let's say a candidate has 6.5 for writing task 1 and 6.0 for writing task 2, which means that the overall score will be 6.5 because it's only 1/3. And the overall score is closer to 6.0 rather than 6.5. And the opposite situation actually is very interesting because if we have, for example, 6.0 for writing task 1 and 6.5 for writing task 2, the overall score for writing will be 6.5. So we need to think about time really very carefully. The next point is about energy. So when we talk about the IELTS exam, actually, this is a complex exam consisting of 4 sections, but we have 3 sections that are completed one by one without any formal breaks, which means that the energy that we have might get drained by the end of the time when we are finishing the test. And since writing is the final part of the test, it is important to keep to take into consideration our energy. So for example, not to waste lots of energy on listening and reading. And I mean here even negativity, because if, for example, something goes wrong with reading or listening, it will affect our attitude and our energy in the final section. Or there might be situations when we have the second breath, something that we call this way, when we are more energized when we start the writing section. But usually the situation is that the energy levels are lower when we start the writing section. From this perspective, it's a good idea to practice full tests a few times and see how well we can manage our energy throughout the whole tests. And one more thing that I think is really, really important, especially when we talk about writing, is about 2 versions of the IELTS exam. So currently, we have 2 options to sit either paper-based tests, and then we will handwrite actually the whole writing section. So you will have to, for example, write 400 words or even more during 1 hour, which is a bit more difficult now because we are used to, for example, typing. Or another format, a computer-delivered one, where you have a chance to type. So it might be a good idea to consider which of the available formats you are going or your students are going to take and practice writing a task, for example, visuals on essays, either handwriting or by typing. And in this way, getting used to the pace and management of time and actually understanding how much you can write within the allocated time. And when we talk about the computer delivered version, there are actually a few benefits. So number 1, you'll see the word count in the program itself. And number 2, it's easier to edit typed text in comparison with handwritten text. And actually, you don't have to write draft, or if you write it, you can edit it really quickly and easily. So a few important things of a general level. Next, when we talk about IELTS visuals, we talk about different kinds of visuals. And the question is, what are they? And how important is it actually to know them? So on the next slide, we'll see actually different kinds of visuals that we might have in the IELTS exam. And as for the second part of the question, I think this is a very important point of preparation. So for example, we know how to describe, for example, tables, right? But in the exam, we might have a task which focuses on describing maps. And since we don't know how to deal with those tasks, starting with how to understand what is in the maps, how to organize this information, how to choose important information, it takes more time, more energy, and as a result, the score is a bit lower because the situation is unexpected. So from this perspective, an essential point will be to get acquainted with all the possible types of tasks. And could I ask you to type in the chat box what kind of visuals we might have in the IELTS writing task 1? So one of them, as I mentioned, is tables, and another one is maps, but there are some other types of visuals. Pie charts, bar charts, right, true. Yep, flow charts, okay, yeah. I see that some of you use the term graph. So graph is a very general term because we have basically a few specific kinds of graphs, right? So let's have a look at what we might have in the exam. So something what some of you called graphs, we usually call these line graphs, right? And we might have one line like in the line graph example here. We might have 2, 3, or sometimes 5 lines. which depends on the task, right? But this is one of the tasks that we might have. Another one that is currently called a bar chart. Basically, we have bars that represent different kinds of figures, or another term for that is bar graph. So that's the reason why I said that the word graph is a very general one. We can have tables, we can have pie charts. And when we talk about pie charts, we might have, for example, 2 pie charts, 3 pie charts, sometimes 4 pie charts. But another kind of task is when we can have a combination of any 2 or sometimes 3 kinds of visuals. So for example, we might have a pie chart and a line graph, a bar chart and a table, a line graph and for example, a table. So there might be a combination, and we need to be ready with understanding how to deal with this task. And the 2 final tasks will be a map. So this is basically about, let's say, one location or a place. And this could be a map of this place in the past and now. This could be a map of this place now and in the future, or in the past and in the future. Usually this is about 2 maps, but sometimes this is about 3 maps. And process, or this is something that some of you call the flow chart. This is another type of it. Of process. So actually we might have 2 kinds of processes. One where things happen in real nature. We call them natural processes. For example, the life cycle of a hummingbird or the life cycle of a frog. Or we might have industrial processes. The example is here when we talk about how things work, for example, in man-made processes. So when we look at all the variety of these tasks, we'll see that they are in a way different. Some of them are very similar to each other. Some of them are different. But at the same time, knowing all the variety of possible tasks is important. And when we talk about the differences between these 2 types, or these 6 types of diagrams, charts and tables, we can generally divide them into 2 types of tasks. This will be important because of the choice of language and the way to organize the response. So you see examples of tasks on the left which have changes over time. So for example, one of the lines, which is a horizontal line, would be different years or a period of time, for example, from 2000 to 2010. And then we have changes over time. So that's why we call this kind of visual dynamic. Maps are also dynamic, examples of dynamic visuals, but we usually have 2 or sometimes 3 different years, not more than that. Sometimes you might have tasks without any changes, or these are static visuals. For example, when we have just 1 year, so if we look at the table here, it might be an example of different kinds of categories and countries and percentage of spending of these countries on these categories based on 1 year only. So there are no changes over time. And the bar chart could be also an example of a task where we might not have changes over time. So why knowing this is important? When we talk about visuals with changes over time, we will use some special language. For example, the number of applications increased or decreased significantly or marginally. So we will use some language which shows us the dynamics, the changes. But when we have a task without changes over time, we won't be able to use usually these different kind of language because we don't have any changes over time. We might compare the percentage which is higher, the percentage which is lower. We might talk about popularity, which is low and high, but we cannot talk about the increase or decrease in figures. We might say that, for example, the figures are lower and higher in comparison with some other figures. And if we talk about dynamic charts, or visuals, basically all of them, with the exception, basically all of them can be dynamic. But if we talk about static, for example, maps are not static because we talk about different years. Line graphs are not static because we talk about changes over time. Let's say processes are in a way dynamic because we talk about change from one stage to another, but it's not change over time as in, for example, line graphs and bar charts. So why is this important? When looking at the task for the first time, see if you can identify whether this is a static or a dynamic visual, and then your choice of language and organization will depend on that. Then, let's look at the tasks and think about why we need to actually familiarize ourselves with the tasks. It might seem very obvious when you have a task to first look at the task. But from my experience and from experience of the students who I've been working with, they might spend very little time on looking at the task and understanding the task, which will be reflected in less clear description, description which doesn't focus on important elements and which doesn't do what the task asks us to do. So that's why it is a very important part or step when dealing with any kind of task, but in particular visuals, to spend some time on understanding the task. And this is what we're going to be doing now. So let's look at the task that we have on the next slide. If you look at both parts, the left and the right part, we have two parts of the task. The first one is verbal, where we have the description of what a visual describes, and it typically starts with the graph, the table, the diagram shows, and then some key information about the task. And the second part of this verbal part is actually how we need to approach the description of how we need to deal with the task. And you see here three important elements highlighted red. Why they are important. So let's have a look at them in more detail. So if we talk about summarizing, it means that we basically need to focus on some important parts, important elements, important figures, important objects, but we do not have to, and we must not, let's call it this way then, describe all the details. And when we talk about assessment criteria, one of them says that if we recount details mechanically, basically describe every single figure in the way it's described in the visual, then we won't get a score which is higher than 6 for this criterion. It's called task completion. So summarizing means mentioning important points, but not writing a lot. And word count of at least 150 words is actually connected with it. When you write 250 words, it's not a summary. When you write 150 words up to 200, 220, that's absolutely fine, as long as we don't focus on every single detail and describe everything in depth. In connection with it, there is a point about main features, and this is some important information that we have in diagrams. So basically, this is something that is worth looking at, is worth spotting, and is worth describing. And this is something that we are also assessed on, because if we don't focus on these main features, again, we are scored lower in, for example, this task completion criterion. And the final thing is comparison. This is basically not just describing every single line, for example, in this visual, but thinking about the way how to compare them and actually show some language for comparison. Just apart from these requirements, we must show the language to describe these visuals, and making comparisons is actually one of the ways to show this language. And now it's time to look at the visual part. And if we talk about this line graph, we actually have a few lines, 3 of them, which represent 3 kinds of dwelling that people used, for example, from 2000 to 2012. And of course, we see here the vertical axis, which represents the percentage, and the horizontal axis, which represents a period of time of 13 years, from 2000 to 2012. And we have 3 different kinds of dwelling highlighted using different colors. So of course, because we talk about a period of time, this line graph is dynamic. And let's take a moment to have a look at some important features of this line graph. So what do you think these important or main features are? And can you please type them in the chat box, just a few words? So for example, if we look at the line for duplex and triplex, so we can see that the percentage of using this kind of accommodation actually increases over time, right? And overall it goes, decreases over time, So it goes down. So this is one of the features of this task and main features, basically, of this line graph. So what are the main features of this line graph? Right, so let's have a look at basically some examples, and a very important step is actually understanding what main features are and how to look for them. So if we look at the line graph again, we need to identify main features, and for line graphs, they will be called trends. Basically, when we talk about trends, we talk about changes of percentage or numbers over years. And in this situation, we need to have a look at the beginning and at the end of the whole period for each line and identify the trend. So for example, if we talk about duplex or triplex, as you mentioned, the trend is downward because the figures go down throughout the whole period with some fluctuations. And if we look at some other lines, railroad actually has a similar trend because the figures actually go down throughout the whole period. And with studios, we have lots of fluctuations, right? So basically the period of fluctuations, but overall, the trend is an upward one. I would basically call it fluctuations plus an upward trend. This is something important to look at when we talk about identifying main features or trends in this situation. But if we talk about main features, there's something else. It's a little thing if we look at it in a moment, but it's still worth paying attention to. If we talk about some important points, let's look at the beginning of this period. If we talk about railroads, so the figures for this type of dwelling are the highest at the beginning of this period. And actually, this is a leader among all these types of dwellings in the year 2000. But by the end of this period, the leader had changed, which means that now we have a new one, studio, with the highest figures. So when we talk about line graphs, this is something important to pay attention to. Then the next part will be about comparison. So how can we make comparison and actually use this comparison to describe these different kinds of figures? So as we've identified a bit earlier, we have two lines that have a downward trend, and these are railroad and duplex triplex. And studio actually stands out because the trend is opposite. So we can actually describe duplex triplex together with railroad and focus on similarities, and then focus on studios in comparison. So basically showing contrast or difference. Another way to do it is actually compare one of the downward trends with the upward trend, and then focus on another downward separately. So this will allow us to focus on not just describing all the details, but focus on comparing these important features. This is one of the ways actually to show comparison. So comparison by trends or by kinds of trends. Another way to do it is actually to use some language which shows this similarity or difference. So for example, when describing this line graph, we can say that the trends for duplex, triplex, and railroad types of accommodations were similar throughout the whole period, right? So we use the word similar. Or when we talk about describing difference, we can say the trends for, let's say, studio was opposite or was downward, or however, or by contrast, the figures for the studio type of accommodation had a reverse or a different pattern. And then we might use some words like linkers, however, by contrast, or use some phrases like reverse or opposite trend, for example, which show this similarity or difference. And in the same way, we can use some linkers like in a similar vein, for example, similarly, in the same way, a similar pattern to show similarity. So again, making comparisons is one of the tasks that we have to focus on. And this is something important to take into consideration while planning and while writing the task. Let's have a look at a few other examples of visuals and focus on these 3 steps. So spending some time understanding the task, and here we focus on the verbal part and the visual part. And when we talk about the verbal part, I'd suggest underlining or highlighting some key phrases, especially when we talk about the description of the visual, because they will give you all the important parts of what the line graph or another task is about. Identifying main features is, again, a very important step because this is a requirement of the task and we assessed on having them or not having them. For example, if we don't focus on main features, for example, using a separate sentence or 2 sentences at the beginning or at the end of the description, then we will be scored down and we won't have more than band 4, band 5, which means that it does affect directly the score that we might have, and that's why this is an important skill to develop. And of course, making comparisons at different levels. When we talk about comparing information, basically grouping different features, and we talk about language comparison, either using linkers, for example, of contrast and order or similarity, and we talk about some language to focus or to describe this difference, like in a similar way, a reverse pattern, and some other things. And let's have a minute or so to look at the task and decide whether this is a static or dynamic visual or table. So please write or type in the chat box what you think. Is it a static or dynamic visual? Mm-hmm. Okay. Right. So Vera and Yulia are saying that this is a static visual table, and I absolutely agree with you, ladies. So when we talk about this table, we don't have any years except for 2015. So basically all the data is about one and the same year, and we don't talk about changes over time. So absolutely agree with you. When we talk about this kind of table, it's interesting because we have actually a few important components. So number one is 6 different kinds of applications, starting with email and finishing with other. And we can talk about 3 age groups, starting with 13 and finishing with 31. And we have lots of figures representing percentage of using these applications. And when we talk about understanding the task, we need to spend a minute or so on looking at the description of the visual and what's inside. Let's move on and talk about main features. And can you please spend a little time on looking at this table and thinking about what the main features are in this table. So when we talked about line graph, we talked about trends, for example, downward, upward trends of fluctuations. So what kind of features do we have here? So, of course, we also talk about some trends or tendencies here. And For example, we might focus on more popular and less popular applications. So you might have noticed that, for example, email and social media generally have higher percentages than the other types of applications, which means that we can group email and social media together and then focus on the other types of applications separately. Which actually gives us an overview of some key trends. We might focus on some very specific things. So for example, saying what is the most popular application. So for example, I think it's difficult to identify because we have percentage which is more or less similar, I mean, overall, right? We can talk about, let's say, least popular application, which I believe is 813, which is public transit, right? Which means that basically all the age groups use this kind of application least of all. But when we talk about trends, it's a good idea to focus on the majority of all of them if this is possible for this task, rather than focusing on just the leader and the category or applications with lowest percentage, right? Okay, so that's the way to identify trends for such kinds of tables. And let's think about how we can make comparisons here. And I'd suggest two approaches. Since we have types of applications and we have age groups, so which of them, of these approaches, will we use to organize and compare information? By age groups, so for example, describing each age group at a time, or by types of applications. So can you please think about your own way and type in the chat A or B? I see some of you are focusing and choosing B, all right. Great, okay, all right. Yeah, so both approaches are possible, but let's have a look which of these approaches is more reasonable. For example, if we talk about age groups, we might focus on each of them, but we will only compare figures within each age group, right? Which means that, for example, let's focus on the first one from 13 to 28. We can talk about the leader, which is social media. Then we have number two, which is email and other, the percentage of which is nearly the same. And basically the other three applications have a negligible 3 to 5% of use. At the same time, you will repeat the same approach for 1924 and for the third age group, which might mean that you won't be able to make lots of comparison or might not make use of all the possible ways to compare. However, when we talk about types of applications, it's a good idea to focus on them and describe, for example, email and social media as the applications with higher percentage or more popular applications, comparing these figures, and then focus on the other four applications and talk about some outstanding figures and some common, let's say, or similar percentage, right? Some of them are more popular, some of them are less popular, some of them have higher percentage, some of them lower. So for example, public transit stands out because the percentage is stable within all the categories from 4 to 5%. But if we look at, for example, the category of weather, we can see that with age, the popularity or the use of applications increases, or with news, the same thing, right? So we can still focus on the use of this language of change, but within specific categories. So from my perspective, focusing on types of applications and grouping them by popularity will be a bit more reasonable because you might have more ways to compare information. But again, by age group is also possible, probably just less, fewer opportunities to describe. And let's have a look at another task, which is maps. and look at the task itself, I mean the verbal part and the visual part, and again, identify whether it's static or dynamic here. Right, so yep, absolutely agree with you. This is an example of a dynamic visual. We have actually two different years, 1967 and now, although not many like changes over years, but we have a picture of this village in 1967 and the same village today. So when we talk about this kind of visual, let's think about what the main features are in this visual, and let's look at these maps in detail. So for example, if we look at something red here, this is a farm, right? In 1967, there was only one building, but then today it has actually three buildings and it has turned into a three-building complex, right? So we can say that the farm has expanded. So what are some other changes that happen, that have happened to this Slovan village? Okay, let me help you with a few of them. So we can talk about, for example, separate houses or cottages even in 1967, but today we actually have a housing area with modern buildings and some high-rise buildings even, right? When we talk about the market, basically it has been removed, no, sorry, it was relocated, right? And now it's in the other part of the town here, right? And again, it has increased in size. Yep, so private houses, right? Okay. To help you see more of these changes, right? Resources for energy, right? Let's have a look at this slide. So basically, we can talk about farmhouse, we can talk about old windmill, we can talk about cottages, the market itself, and a highway, as well as wind turbines. If we talk about these changes, we can actually group them by the changes that basically something has happened to these objects, or new objects have appeared. So I would say that it takes at least a few minutes to compare both maps and notice what has happened, right? Either something has changed, it could be like relocated, expanded, demolished, right? Turned into something bigger, right? Or there might be some new objects that didn't exist, for example, in the first map. And let's have a look at basically the main changes. So in order to deal with maps, it's a good idea to focus on some specific changes first, notice them, and then think about a more general overview of these changes. So what do you think could be main changes or main features for this map or for this task with maps? And let's have a look at my suggested ideas. So I'd say that generally, the territory of the village has increased and it has become more modern because of the housing area and because of the infrastructure, including a highway, including wind turbines, including the expansion of the marketplace. So basically, I think that overall, this village has become much more modern and convenient to live in and to work in. And finally, let's think about comparison. So basically, how can we compare information in these maps? And again, we have two options. Number one is about describing each map separately. So for example, the first year first, and then this village today second. Or thinking about grouping changes by some criteria of focusing on some different kinds of changes. So again, think about this and type in the chat box whether you think a good approach could be A, years, or B, changes. Yeah, thank you very much, ladies. So as I see now, you understand that the second approach is more reasonable because we have more opportunities to compare. True, right. And I would do it in the same way as we had on the previous slide. I would focus on modifications. So the objects that have been replaced, demolished, or relocated, and new objects that were non-existent in the first map, right? And basically, when we talk about the organization of this description, we would have, for example, two body paragraphs focusing on modifications in the first one and focusing on new objects in the second one. And it's basically a logical way to organize. At the same time, there might be some other approaches, for example, geographical location. We could talk about the main part of the village with its modifications, and we could talk about, for example, the other part with highway and wind turbines. The objects will be the same, but the approach to comparing information will be slightly different, basically geographical part. Some other maps might focus clearly on geographical parts. So then you'll focus on the location of the objects rather than the types of objects and the way they have changed. A few more things to take into consideration when writing. So something really, really important based on my own experience, and I think it might be useful in your preparation and in your teaching. So number one, this is about main features, and this is a requirement to give an overview of main features. What I mean? Usually in the introduction or as a separate paragraph or in the conclusion, we need to summarize these changes. For example, overall, the village, the Slovan village, has expanded or has increased in size with lots of modifications related to housing and infrastructure. So this is a bit more general overview, but it gives an important understanding what has changed and in what way. And then when we talk about body paragraphs, then you organize them focusing on these more specific changes. Then using paragraphs, which is less important for visuals, but still a good idea to focus on using separate paragraphs and grouping information either by similarity, for example, similar trends, or by difference, or by similar objects or similar changes will be important and will ensure clearer organization of the responses, and it will be much easier for the assessors, so someone who will mark these responses, to see your logic and to follow it, because it actually adds up to the score. Another thing is related to using information from the visuals. So when we describe just some main changes without using any figures or using any description of objects, that won't let us get a higher score. But it is important to use figures from this description. Basically, it might be some key features, key changes, key figures, for example, at the beginning or at the end of the period. And it's a good idea also to use some language for comparison. We have an example here. The figures increased by 5%. It's one more way to actually show comparison. We might state that in 2000, the percentage was, for example, 5. In 2010, the percentage was 10. Another way to do it, we can say that in the second year, the percentage increased by 5% in comparison with the first year. And we avoid this recounting details mechanically, which is one of the cut-ups or cut-offs when we talk about grading, right? So we might get a better score because of using these figures. Another one is related to linkers and language for comparison. And we talked about different kinds of language for referring or progressing ideas, for showing contrast and showing similarity. And now let us see how well we understand what we have to do and what we don't have to do. On the next slide, you'll see a task, the same task with line graphs and 3 types of dwelling: duplex, triplex, then railroad and studio, and a description of this diagram. I'd like you to take around 2 minutes and tell me in the chat, for example, type in the chat whether this description is good and why it's good, and whether this description is not good and why it's not good. So let's spend around 2 minutes and please type your ideas in the chat box. Mm-hmm. Anastasia is sharing a point about not paraphrase introduction. Mm-hmm. Right. Informal language, yet not enough words. Okay, very nice. Adding own opinion. Right, very good. Description of separate dwelling. All right. Mm-hmm. Very nice. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Now, let me comment on this description because I think that overall, this is a good description because of the following things. So first, we do have an attempt to summarize main features in the introduction. And this is generally a good point because not including it will lead to being scored down and getting, for example, band 5 or band 4 and band 5 for task completion, right? But at the same time, the writer or the author didn't focus on railroad. The author focused only on 2 out of the 3 lines. So that's the point. Then when we talk about the organization, so first in the body paragraph, the writer focuses on studios and uses figures to compare information and figures to support basically these strands. And then he or she moves on to focus on duplexes, triplexes, and again, some figures and data there. There is a conclusion, which is a bit problematic, but we'll focus on that in a moment. And when we talk about disadvantages, so some of you were absolutely right. I think it was Anastasia saying that the introduction isn't paraphrased. This is about vocabulary language. We can also talk about different kinds of linkers. So here we have basically just very simple linkers. Basically, my favorite one, because I use it really a lot in my speaking, and, but, and all in all. I didn't highlight this one, but all in all is another linker, which isn't a good, they are not good examples of linkers for the academic style. Basically, we might use more complex ones, something like moreover, however, in addition, by contrast, right, to show this. Then some of you have noticed this. We have reasons why something have happened, but these reasons are not described. And we have prediction or what might happen in the future, but this prediction isn't based on any figures from this line graph, which means that this information is irrelevant. One more thing, pay attention to this addressing you if you compare them with studios. When we talk about academic style, we should avoid this addressing and use less personal one. For example, using passive voice, if to compare or if these things are compared. Or use people, sometimes it's more about essays, but still. And of course, many of you have noticed that this description isn't about 150 words. There are fewer words, which automatically leads to a penalty. And overall, it might take, for example, half a band from the score for this kind of task. I'll take around 5-7 more minutes of your time, and I hope that's okay with you, because there's something important to summarize and to mention. So when we talk about preparation for the IELTS exam and for visuals in particular, it's a very good idea, and I would even insist on that, to familiarize ourselves with all the possible types of tasks in order to know what they are, how to work with them, and even a more important thing is to spend some time describing all of them. So basically practicing writing them. This will help actually better understand how, in what way these tasks are similar, and make use of the strategies that are useful in terms of time management and task management. Another one is not to forget to spend some time to analyze the task and to look at the verbal part, underlining or highlighting key points, and to look at the visual part and identify main trends, and think about how to logically organize information. This is all about the planning stage, but I believe that if we spend at the beginning from 3 to 5 minutes or even more in planning, this time reduces and you might end up spending 1 to 2 minutes. Basically, when our eye is trained, we don't need to spend that much time because we already spot some main features. We already spot the way how we could organize it. And basically our brain is better ready for these different kinds of tasks. Of course, another one is to find some good time and spend it at the beginning. I know that some students, candidates, and some teachers say, but for example, if we spend 5 minutes out of 20 on planning, will we be able to describe the whole task within 20 minutes? The answer is yes and no. It depends on how we approach that. If we plan each stage, for example, if we look at the task and identify main trends, think about organization, it might not take us a lot of time, but we will have a much clearer picture of how to organize the response and what to write about. So basically, you won't be doing free writing like with essays and ideas, but you will know what exactly you'll be focusing on. And of course, the final part will be about linkers, so making use of them and especially focusing on examples of more formal, more complex linkers, and making sure that when we organize our ideas, we can make use of paragraphs. So the examples of the tasks that we have had today in the webinar were taken from our online platform, IELTS Grade. On the platform, you will find actually all the 4 sections: reading, listening, speaking, writing. But the IELTS academic writing is a very detailed section with all the steps there. It starts with basically understanding the tasks, and we are focusing on all the tasks there, and finishing with using specific language for specific tasks, using our knowledge bank in terms of language and strategies, and you will get feedback from our IELTS experts based on the writing that you do. And of course, for all the types of tasks that we have on the platform, you will have a chance to practice and actually check your responses. All the participants of the webinar today have a unique opportunity to use a promo code and have a discount of 20 euros on all the study plans that we have there. And basically, this is a good idea to think about which of the packages you might choose. And one of the benefits of this platform is that you can get feedback with detailed analysis of what is good, what is still to be worked on, based on your understanding, your knowledge, and to know for yourself what to work with. And this is the link to the platform that you may have a look at. We have a free trial test there, so actually you can see what's inside, and there is some open content there. You may actually click the button, see how it works, what kind of tasks, and benefit from either the free trial test or from any of the packages that we have there. So thank you very much for being here today. Thank you very much for spending this hour on better understanding the visuals that we have in academic writing task 1. Many thanks for your participation and for your answers. I'm really happy that based on the answers that you gave, you have a bit better understanding, and maybe you have even a much better understanding of what the visuals are about, how to work with them, and especially how to plan them. So thank you very much for spending these 60 2 actually minutes with me in this webinar. I wish you all the success possible with teaching IELTS visuals and with preparing your students, with preparing for the test if you're going to take it, and hope to see you in our next webinars devoted to IELTS preparation. Thank you very much. And you will receive a link to the presentations and a link to the recorded webinar a bit later after the webinar finishes. So thank you very much. Wish you a happy weekend and hope to see you sometime soon. And here's the link to our platform in the chat.